So some of you will have these headsets, and Quest and Metaverse will not be so new to you, but for many of you, I imagine it will be. So we didn't think that we could spend 45 minutes talking about privacy, tax, and brands in the Metaverse if we didn't at least try and show you what the Metaverse is. So on that note, let me introduce Dan Owen, who's who's our crash test dummy today, and a member of the Bristow technology team. Dan, you going to give us a wave? A meta wave? There we go. He's looking at a little avatar that you can see of him there. Now, this is Dan in Horizon Worlds. We wanted to give you an example of a metaverse that wasn't too gamey, so that when we go on to talk about tax and brands, it feels a little bit more meaningful than if we'd been going around shooting night elves or something like that. So this is the Meta Horizon World workspace, where you can have meetings and write on whiteboards and all sorts of things that we'll show you now in a moment. Dan, before we do, I think our office, I think it's looking a bit boring. Let's see if we can fix the view outside, shall we? Let's see what you got. Okay, we're at the beach. Okay, this is the Bristow's Copacabana office. Welcome. Now that's the outside taken care of. The inside is still looking a little bit drab, so maybe we can get some posters up or pictures, Dan. What do you think? What we got? Oh, there, right. We got a picture of our standard metaverse picture, which we'll come to in a moment. We're going to put the top 10 one up. Did that go up? There we are. It's just a logo from one of our other publications. Okay, so you can personalize your workspace. That's really all we're showing you here. Now, in front of Dan, on the desk, we have essentially what looks like a tablet. So Dan's going to write something on the tablet, something polite. Not in Welsh, Dan, please. Okay. So the metaverse does nothing for your handwriting, right? Just to be clear, if it's bad in real life, it's no offense, Dan. Right. So there we are. So that has come out on the whiteboard. Now, Dan, if you can go a little bit closer to the whiteboard, please. No, Dan must not fall off the stage, otherwise there's a lawsuit in the metaverse potentially. Right, you good?
I'm good.
Okay. Right, you bob about there. And now, what can we put on the whiteboard? We can do a bit more writing. Today's. Should have been a doctor, right? With that handwriting. Oh my goodness. There he is. What's in the metaverse? There's Julia, and there's Jeremy. So today's speakers on the metaverse. Thank you very much. Well, that's all very nice. Now, Dan, I don't know if you want to. Are you going to stay there, or do you want to sit down?
I'll stay here.
You stay there. Well, so Dan is looking a tad lonely there. So we're going to make a call into the metaverse from inside the room. So we have Karana Holstein, one of our trainees, who's sitting towards the back there, who is about to dial in. We're going to get an echo, I fear, but there, can you see that? There, look. Now, that means some of you all are in the metaverse as well. Probably should have asked you, but anyway. Right, so you can see how you can do a two-way call there. Now, Karana, are you going to share your screen? This is when it starts to get a bit mind-bending, because we'll be sort of in the metaverse, in the room, all at the same time. There you go. So that's what Karana can see on her screen, projected onto the whiteboard in the metaverse. And there's Dan. There he is. Uncanny likeness, right? Okay, Dan. Awesome, right? Can you please join me with a round of applause for Dan and Karana? Okay, so there you go. So there's your metaverse. And we've now switched back. Thank you. I'll just borrow that by way of example. Okay, so what you saw there was obviously virtual reality, but when we're talking about metaverse, typically we're talking about extended reality. So we all tend to think of headsets and immersive 3D worlds, but it would also include things like augmented reality, which will probably be familiar to almost all of you. So some of you don't have to say who, probably got addicted to Pokemon Go once upon a time. The idea where you have a real world, you're in the real world, but your real world experience is extended by seeing digital assets, that kind of thing. I will ask, has anybody got any of the Ray-Ban Story glasses? No? I thought I saw a hand up. No? Okay, so a little bit like the Meta/Ray-Ban version of Google Glass from a few years ago, where you can wear glasses, they look like Ray-Bans, they look very nice, and you can take photos and record and that kind of thing. So there's lots of examples of mixed reality, virtual reality you've just seen, all together. We would call them extended reality, and that's sort of the theme for this topic, really, in terms of what we're trying to cover. So there's lots of different metaverse experiences. It's not right to talk about the metaverse as if there's one thing like there is the internet or the World Wide Web. It tends to be lots of different environments or experiences with various metaverse-like features, if I can put it that way. And on the slide here, I've said, I kind of listed what they are. So it's an interactive experience. So you're interacting with other people in your world. You saw Dan interacting with his room, but also with Kirana there. It's also persistent. What I mean by that is you may enter the world, you may leave the world, but when you're not there, it carries on without you. So if you think about some of the big games like Fortnite and stuff like that, that will just be, or Pokemon Go even, that'll just be running in the background. You're joining, you're coming out. It's like a world almost that carries on without you. It's immersive. So particularly when we're talking about the VR side of things, the focus is on making it as close to real life as much as one can with a headset in terms of what you hear and what you see, and increasingly what you touch as well. People are trying to replicate the experience of real life as far as possible. It ultimately should be interoperable, and this is the reason why at the moment, although there's some interoperability between different providers of metaverses, there isn't ubiquitous interoperability. So if you think of, say, but this is an analogy, if you think of websites, you can link from website to website, of course, and collectively you can think of all of that adding up to the World Wide Web. And it makes sense to talk about the web. At the moment, what we have with these different metaverse-like experiences, that they don't really link up. You can't wander from one metaverse into another very easily. And that, depending on who you listen to, that is the ultimate goal. And we're probably talking, I mean, estimates are always a little bit out, but maybe 10 years, maybe more years away before you have that fully interoperable experience. Because what do we mean by interoperable? We mean commercially interoperable, and we mean technically interoperable. So think commercial interoperability. I'll give you a very good example of where it isn't. If you're in the BA Exec Club, you'll have air miles. If you go into the Virgin, I'm not in the Virgin one, I can't remember what it's called, whatever, the Virgin loyalty program, you can't move from that one to that one. You can join both, you can be in both, but your points in one are not recognized in another. There is not commercial interoperability, and why would there be? It's a loyalty scheme. So what we need is for assets, NFTs, stuff that people buy in one metaverse to be recognized and to carry that value through into other metaverses, ultimately. And then, of course, technically, the challenges are just enormous. So if we had a much more, say we rendered this entire room as a metaverse, that would be next year, come back, it's going to be awesome. It should be possible, ultimately, for me to go through that door and walk into another metaverse provided by another provider, say the Microsoft one, and it to be a seamless experience. We're so far away from that, but that's really the ultimate end game, as I say, many, many years out. But that's kind of what we're talking about. A lot of the technology, a lot of the examples I would use are a bit gaming-led, I would say. So Fortnite, I talked about Pokemon Go already. Roblox, for example, but we didn't want to focus on the gaming side because we did want, You can't talk about gaming and then switch to tax. It's too jarring for people. So we wanted to talk about a sort of business example. And we're videoing this, so it's too late now. I'm going to say it. I'm a little bit of a VR skeptic in the sense of I don't think we're all going to be wandering around or staying at home maybe with headsets on and that'll be our new life. And that's probably not the way to think about it. I think the way to think about this, is it real, what's coming, how much of a challenge is it, is augmented reality. It's already here. You can get an image of your IKEA sofa and on your phone project it into your living room to see if you think it looks good. That's augmented reality. And then for VR, again, it's already here to some extent, but for specific use cases. So you want to show kids in a classroom what the pyramids was like, immersing them in that Egyptian world would be a really rich learning experience. Or you're trying to teach somebody how to work on a factory line that's kind of dangerous. Creating a digital twin of that environment so you can train them virtually, you can see, would also be a positive step forward before you actually let them loose in the real world. So these aren't all the applications, these are just some we picked out. So think about communications. So not that many years ago, maybe just pre-pandemic, we were all on conference calls and it was okay. And now we're all on Zoom or Teams or whatever, and it has its frustrations, but it's generally better because it's more interactive and you can see people. But it's still imperfect, and so you still lose a lot of non-verbal communication, and there's all these issues about eye contact and try not to look too shifty and that kind of thing. And the idea is that some of the VR technology will have a role to play in improving communications in time. So that was really just to sort of say, it all sounds a bit sort of sci-fi and Doctor Who, but a lot of it is already here, and a lot of it will be here, if it's not already, very, very soon, but not in the way that we'll all be living in the Matrix or something like that. Right, so that was an intro. I was just going to rattle through some of the privacy side of things. And of course, privacy when everything is code, because I'm really focusing on VR now, where the entire world that the individual is occupying is computer generated. So what does that mean from a privacy point of view? So the first thing to say is that when consumers are surveyed about, well, what's your biggest fear about the metaverse? What's coming? Is it scary? Privacy concerns are consistently near the top of the list, or possibly at the top of the list, which would point you in the direction of you've got to crack the privacy issues if you're going to get a good level of adoption of the metaverse. People won't want to be there if they have great concerns about their privacy. Now, that sounds maybe quite persuasive. All I would say is that privacy issues have topped consumer surveys in relation to online services as people's greatest fear for years. And yet it hasn't stopped people participating fully in free services where they don't really know what happens about their data and they don't care, but because ultimately it's a free service and that's great. So the trade-off between service and privacy is quite a complex one. So I'm not saying privacy is going to dictate this, but we are already seeing companies trying to embed privacy because some of the issues that one sees with this level of data collection, which I'll talk about in a moment, are just not even another level. They're like another level and then another level beyond what we see today in relation to the internet. So privacy is a main concern. There's related issues to do with surveillance. So just think about this. At the moment, if you're thinking about surveillance, you're thinking about people following you, watching you, maybe listening in on you, that kind of thing. Maybe your Alexa is telling tales on you or something like that. You're in a world where there is arguably a limit. CCTV, of course, especially in the UK. So that there is a level of surveillance in the real world, but you can get away from it. You might have to think about it. Think about that obscure mountain in Wales where you're going to go, there's no technology. You could get away from it. In the metaverse, in a VR metaverse, where everything is computer generated, how do you get away from it? Everything you do in that world is logged, at least, possibly recorded. It'll be on a computer somewhere. So I'll give you another example. I could step down here and I could go up to Adrian, who's in the front row there, and I could whisper, there he is, I could whisper in his ear and you wouldn't hear it. How do I do that in the metaverse? So you can have a room with loads of people in it. How do you whisper in the metaverse? How does the technology incorporate this idea of privacy or confidentiality in a similar way? And I'm not saying it can, but these are some of the challenges that people will need to start to think about. I mentioned freedom of expression. I'm not going to talk about it a great deal other than there's a lot of people making user-generated content, artistic content, literary content, whatever it is, expressing themselves on these platforms. And they have rights too. So it's not all about privacy. There's freedom of expression. There's freedom to conduct a business. There's loads of charter rights that all need to be brought to bear and balanced out when we think about how the metaverse should work. The jurisdictional issue is basically a bit of a nightmare. It's already a nightmare. This makes it like a double nightmare in the sense that this idea that it's a virtual space and there's no law. I mean, we heard that 20, 30 years ago in relation to the internet. It's the Wild West, there's no law, do what you want. Obviously, that was completely wrong. The metaverse will turn out to be the same. It'll have more law than anywhere else. There'll be more law in the metaverse than there will be in the real world, just because of the global reach of all of these laws. You'll be in a space where you could have Californian law, GDPR, South Korean law, if any of you looked at that, that is a bad day in the office. All of those applying at the same time in a very uncertain way. And it's not like you look at it and you think, right, I figured it all out now. It's not like that. You're in this corner of the metaverse, and sure, maybe it's subject to GDPR. Then you go through this door, and now, hang on a minute, I've just gone through a virtual door, but now I'm subject to Californian law. Maybe the individual that I'm interacting with, maybe they have GDPR rights, privacy rights, but that person, maybe they don't, because they're in different places. There's a tremendous amount of complexity here, which, on the one hand, I've heard some people say, well, so it's great, because the regulators won't know what law applies, and they'll never be able to get us. But the bigger challenge is, if you're trying to build a metaverse, and you're trying to wire in privacy by design, because there are choices about how you build this stuff that are being made right now. If when you're figuring out how to do it, you can't figure out what law you're building to or what values or principles or whatever it is, it makes it a bit of a problem. Anyway, right, rattling on. Data collection, it's a question of scale. So this is Dan's headset. This is still on, Dan. You're still in there, This is the Quest 2. It's got cameras, accelerometers, gyroscopes, loads of different sensors. It's recording a lot of stuff. It's measuring 12 different things. Let me get this right. 12 different movements are tracked 90 times a second. And that's just what Dan's up to. So 20 minutes of VR use will generate 2 million data points. And that's just recording about you. That's not what you're doing in the metaverse. So it's an incredible amount of data, like a game-changing level of data in terms of scale. The other thing we have to think about is the surroundings. So when you were sat there, Dan, and you had it on, could you see anything at all? No. Not really. However, this does have cameras in it. This is still sensing the environment around it. And there is a way to see what it's seeing. And it needs to, because it needs to know where you are. It needs to think about you not bumping into things. And it's collecting that information. Or let me give you a better example. Forget the VR. Think about the AR headset, the augmented reality glasses. That only works by laying stuff on top of what you see in the real world. So you have to think, well, where are you? So where am I recording? Is that a private space? What about all these bystanders whose data I'm recording as well? So there's all sorts of issues connected with what data is being collected from a sort of inadvertent point of view almost. And then we've got the special category issue. We're getting into the, I imagine most of you are familiar with GDPR and the fact that it has special category data, personal data in there, race, ethnicity, sexuality, biometric. I won't go through the whole list. If the data you're collecting falls into that category, we don't need to go into it, there's just more stuff to do. It is harder to comply. You've got to look after it more. And biometrics, where it might be, a device might be scanning your iris or tracking your pupils or monitoring your gestures, anything where it's capturing physical characteristics in a way that it can use to identify you will be biometric data, will be special category, will make life hard in terms of how you do that from a compliance point of view, which sounds bad. But then think of it this way. This device will be tracking my eyes. It will be looking, it wants to know what I'm looking at. Sounds terrible, but it needs to know where I'm pointing, what I'm looking at, because it can then prioritize putting that in focus. It's creating this incredibly complicated graphic image. And so it says, right, Mark's looking at that car, we'll start there. So from a functionality point of view, it's really important. But they also know, oh, he's really interested in cars. Let's serve him an ad for cars. So what you look at starts to become your automatic like button, if I can put it that way. Right, we're going to rattle through because we're going to run out of time already. You saw Dan's avatar. It was a bit like you, it wasn't just like you. But think about this. If you have an avatar and somebody makes a choice about skin tone or other characteristics to get a good likeness, then is that special category data? Is that race data? Is that ethnicity? Good arguments why it isn't. Also unhelpful case law as to why it is, or at least maybe. Right, last slide. Whenever GDPR or any privacy law comes up against an ecosystem, it's a problem. Lots of parties, all doing lots of different things, all sharing lots of data. And all the privacy lawyers are thinking, yeah, well, who's a controller? Or who's a processor? And it just doesn't fit terribly well, or at least not very easily. And in the metaverse, where we're going to have lots of metaverse providers, all sharing data because it needs to be interoperable, loads of developers, a marketplace, there'll be a Bitcoin exchange in there potentially, a digital billboard, there'll be all sorts of people getting data. And then the user has a role as well, because they're the ones who are deciding what data to share about themselves. How do you figure out responsibility in that situation? The EU solutions thus far has been pretty much, everybody's a joint controller. You're all responsible, figure it out yourselves. That may not be good enough when we get onto a metaverse at scale. Last couple of points. Individuals have a right of access of all their data. I just told you how much data Dan was generating there in his little demo, tons of it. Can Dan really go to Meta and say, I'd like a copy of all my data, please? Can everybody do that? Not just for that demo, but for everything? It sounds far-fetched. We've already seen it with other tech platforms where people have asked for access to a record of all of their interactions with the platform. And we've also seen the regulator say, yeah, that's fine, what's the problem? So that's a worry, as is data retention. This will be a record. It's like a digital history. Everything you do in the metaverse will be recorded. It'll be logged. That's what the metaverse is. It's code, recording things. How long should that be kept for? That's new, right? In the real world, unless somebody's filming you, there's not really a record of what you've been up to. Not a complete record. In the metaverse, that may be different. So just to finish off, solutions. Having been the person who's been banging the watch here, I'm finding myself running over. There's a technical solution and there's a legal solution. The technical solution is about how do you wire this stuff in from a privacy by design point of view, and I'm not going to go into it. I'm not really going to go into the legal solution other than to say I think it needs to achieve a balance. And what I mean by that is this. If you have a privacy law that is a bit rubbish, and it lets companies do too much and doesn't protect data, you will erode trust and people will be less keen on going into the metaverse because we know privacy is a concern. Okay, hits adoption. If you have a privacy law that is too strict and doesn't allow sharing and doesn't support interoperability between providers, that will stop the metaverse fulfilling its potential. So what we need is the right privacy laws. The brilliant punchline would be saying, we have GDPR, but I'm afraid I would probably put that in the second category of being a little bit too strict for the time being.
Now, I hate to open my segment of this talk by disappointing you all, but I do feel it is my duty as a tax lawyer to let you know that at least the second part of that old adage, the only certain things are death and taxes, is still going to ring true in the metaverse. I'm sure we could all have a fascinating philosophical debate about what happens to the first part of that sentence, given that your avatar could technically live forever. But moving on to the tax, I think, it may take a little while for the tax man or woman to find you in the metaverse, but find you, I think they will. So contrary to a couple of interesting views I've heard expressed on this topic recently, my strong view is that unfortunately donning, as Dan did, the virtual headset doesn't gain you access to a utopian tax-free zone. The metaverse is not some giant virtual tax haven, and the real world tax rules are still going to bite in there. So the question is therefore not so much if tax will apply in the metaverse, but exactly how. And in particular, is our existing tax infrastructure sophisticated enough to be able to effectively police those existing rules in the metaverse to make sure that the right amount of tax is collected and in the right place? And again, on that topic, my view is, well, yes, it's complicated, and we're not going to have the appropriate tools immediately at our disposal, but the international tax community is going to get us there. Now, if you'd asked me that same question at the start of my career, I'd have said, don't be so ridiculous, that problem is just too difficult a challenge for everyone to cope with. But in the last decade, we've had such a seismic shift in the international tax community that actually, there are some good building blocks there now for rules that we can add onto to cope with the challenges that this world's going to present from a tax perspective. A huge chunk of the hard work's already been done at OECD level, and that started with the work they did over a decade ago now to tackle what's called base erosion and profit shifting, so basically avoidance mechanisms that were used by global multinationals. That work set off a chain of events and a kind of momentum that has led to them now developing specific rules to tax the particular challenges of the digital economy. And it's those rules that are going to start to come into play as you enter a kind of metaverse world. And then on top of that, the OECD has been instrumental in developing what's known as the Common Reporting Standard, essentially a framework that now exists across the globe for the effective sharing of tax information between different tax jurisdictions. And I think, as I said, the whole combination of all of that work has led to a place where there is now a decent starting point to then work from to bolt on the rules that are going to be needed in the metaverse. So whilst I'm certain that the metaverse is not a virtual space where tax law simply will not be able to reach you, the application of those laws is still going to be a significant challenge. And I think a common theme across both what Mark and Jeremy and I are all going to talk about is one of those challenges being the jurisdiction issue. I've done the classic error of failing to click my slide. Anyway, the first major issue is that one of identifying the correct tax jurisdiction. And the second of the challenges really is identifying exactly what type of activity or transaction should actually be taxed in the metaverse. So firstly, onto the where. Before I delve in too deeply here, a small caveat that to answer this question technically correctly, you really do have to deal separately with what's known as direct tax, so tax on broadly profits like corporation tax and income tax, and then indirect tax, so transaction taxes, the most notable of which is VAT and sales tax equivalents in other jurisdictions. So they're split out in this table, but broadly, everybody knows that establishing tax rules and policy is the sovereign right of every single nation, and to make that work, our tax systems necessarily have to carve up the tax base in one way or another between the various jurisdictions across the world. And in order to make sure that act of carving up doesn't create total and utter chaos everywhere, both in the real world and in virtual ones, there are broadly accepted international tax concepts that tend to be applied in the vast majority of places. And that means we're already starting from a place where most countries would agree that the correct starting point for identifying the jurisdiction with the primary taxing rights in relation to any metaverse transaction is going to be the place where the metaverse seller, in whatever transaction you're dealing with, is operating from in the real world. So where are they when they're effectively donning their headset? And that requires you to take a look at tax residency rules, which in a corporate context means looking at where is the place of incorporation of the company, if you've got a company behind that headset. It might also require you to look at permanent establishment rules, effectively where are you physically based when you're entering the metaverse, and what building are you in that's most connected with the transaction that you're doing in the metaverse. So then with that baseline level of information around location, it's then possible to determine whether any other tax rules kind of shift that basic taxing right to anywhere else. And in order to look at that shift, you're then going to need to see whether there's any tax treaty rules that would change your tax nexus in any way. And also the biggest global multinationals are going to have an eye to one of the OECD's major pieces of work in this area on digital taxation, which is Pillar 1 of their 2-pillar proposal. Now, Pillar 1, in a very short summary, involves you taking a look at what excess profit has been made by a business over and above its baseline acceptable profit margin, effectively, and then reallocating that excess amount to what's referred to as market jurisdictions, so the places where that business is targeting their advertising and sales efforts. So if you're going to apply all of these rules together, essentially what you're going to need to know is where is the real world physical location of my metaverse seller, and also where is the real world physical location of my metaverse buyer. And although, and I'm going to try and keep to time and not go into too much detail on it, although the sales tax rules will operate slightly differently and are probably going to require you to, as a first step, understand a little bit more about the underlying nature of what's going on with your metaverse transaction before you then decide on the appropriate location. Broadly, that core information about your physical location as a buyer or a seller is going to be really instrumental to actually applying the correct tax rules in the right place. So then that leads us on to the question, whose responsibility is it going to be to collect and deal with that location information? Are we going to leave it to individual metaverse parties that enter the metaverse to self-report and self-police? I would say probably not. I think the challenges of leaving individuals and small businesses to interpret and properly operate what is essentially very complicated tax law are kind of self-evident, and that's one of the reasons why, at least in a VAT context, we've already got the rules on digital services and digital rules that apply for online marketplaces, essentially. So that's rules that operate in the UK and the EU currently, and what those rules do is say that when you have an online sale of goods, the entity that's responsible for effectively paying the VAT and doing all of the associated admin in relation to that transaction is actually the platform that has joined together the buyer and the seller, not the seller themselves. And we've also got forthcoming OECD rules on general kind of reporting obligations that are not quite there yet, but they're coming down the track. Firstly, we've got model rules for reporting by platform operators, and the UK's just released its draft implementation regulations in respect of those model rules. And then on top of that, we've also got a bit further down the track, but the OECD crypto asset reporting framework. And both of these rules and frameworks are essentially there not to move the person who will eventually pay the tax to the platform, but to actually impose on platform operators the obligation to actually collect and effectively collect the information on the location of the people that are using their platforms, and then release that information to the tax authorities, so that the tax authorities have, the resource that they need to then effectively police and go out and see what transactions have actually been taking place. So whilst those existing frameworks might not cover every single type of metaverse asset class or transaction that could occur, I think it's clear that the kind of direction of travel is that in order for this to work from an international tax perspective, metaverse platform operators are likely going to be required to accept a degree of effectively policing and reporting responsibility in respect of the virtual worlds that they're helping to create. So that's the where. And now on to the what. I think it's fair to say that a significant proportion of the commercial activity that's going to take place in the metaverse is essentially going to mirror, from a tax perspective, existing online sales activity. Commercial operators in the metaverse are going to use their virtual shops as a basically shinier, more exciting version of their standard online offering now, with the resulting transactions being a real-world supply of physical goods that gets delivered, from their physical location to a buyer's physical location. And where that is the case, spotting the transaction and then understanding how to tax it is actually, relatively straightforward. We're already doing it now. Where it gets a lot more complicated is where we're dealing with virtual assets. And the best way to try and demonstrate that is to try and apply existing tax law, say UK tax law, to a real life or a virtual life, metaverse life scenario. I think most people would expect that if you manage to turn £15,000 of real, actual English pounds that you own prior to your trip into the metaverse into £25,000 of real English pounds, there's been a transaction there. You've made a profit or gain of £10,000, and subject to reliefs and exemptions, don't get me started, that should be subject to tax. Unfortunately, metaverse tax consequences are rarely going to be as simple as just looking at your net cash position after your excursion into the metaverse. So unlike regular or fiat currency, the UK tax authorities have confirmed that cryptocurrency should be treated as a capital asset for tax purposes in most situations. There's a caveat there. If you have a business as being a crypto trader, that's what you do day in, day out, it's possible the income tax rules will apply to you, but in most situations, capital gains tax rules are going to apply. That means that where you have a Bitcoin, for example, every time you use that Bitcoin to acquire something, you dispose of it. And that disposal is in and of itself a taxable transaction. So each point that one virtual asset is exchanged for another, for example, cryptocurrency exchange for another form of crypto, or cryptocurrency exchange for a token of any description, you are going to need to go through the process of understanding what gain you have made in relation to that disposal. And that's going to involve you looking at what it costs you to acquire, in this case the Bitcoin, and what you've got in return. So in this example, if your NFT one that you buy with your £15,000 worth of Bitcoin, actually at the time of your acquisition of it is worth £40,000, say, in real money, there's clearly a gain there, and that gain needs to be taxed. And this, quite frankly, is blowing quite a lot of people's minds. I think you can see that there is a problem here in that where you're doing multiple exchanges of one token for another token for another token for another token, there are plenty of tax points and plenty of places at which you need to consider, have I made a gain and does a tax liability arise? But at no point in that chain, other than at the very end when you actually take it out of the virtual and back into real hard cash, you don't actually have the cash available at any of those intervening points to fund that liability. So you have what's known as a dry tax charge, which any tax lawyer will tell you is a very bad thing. So ultimately, this isn't a new problem as such. It exists currently in all kind of crypto trades that are happening today, but it's a problem that's going to be particularly challenging in the metaverse because so much of what happens there will be happening in relation to virtual assets and particularly NFTs. I read an interesting statistic the other day that suggested that over 80% of the people that buy and sell cryptocurrency have absolutely no awareness of the facts I've just outlined here, that when you change, say, Bitcoin for Ethereum, that it has any tax impact whatsoever. And I think even fewer people would have any appreciation that swapping, say, their NFT backpack in the metaverse for an NFT baseball cap in the metaverse would also be a disposal which has some kind of tax impact. So I think to deal with this challenge, tax authorities are really going to have to rise up to the issue, face the issue, and also metaverse platform operators generally. They're going to have to accept a significant degree of responsibility for essentially educating metaverse users and also providing some straightforward tools to actually enable your average person to enter the metaverse and understand the tax consequences of being there. And on that note, I would like to thank you for your attention of what is not the most accessible of topics, and hand you over to Jeremy to discuss, frankly, a much more exciting subject.
I'm going to talk about enforcement of trademarks in the metaverse. And I've got some pretty cool looking images up on screen with some funky avatars wearing some pretty swanky clothing. Now, it's fair to say that brands are embracing the metaverse. I think mainly the luxury brands are really interested in what can be done in this new virtual world. there's collaborations happening between lots of luxury brands and Roblox, Sandbox, Decentraland. And I think the idea is it's about engagement. It's about brands getting their ethos, their values, their reputation, their brand across to a new market. And that's one of the core reasons they're really interested. The second reason is selling some merch. They want to make greater sales, and maybe in the metaverse you can actually make a transaction happen. You can maybe buy a digital Gucci jacket, or you could then maybe get off platform and buy the real thing. There might be some sort of link you can buy. So that's the idea behind all this. It is happening, and where there's opportunities for brand owners, there are opportunities for infringers. And I'm not talking about just the general disputes between legitimate companies. This is probably focusing more on the bad guys, the counterfeiters. So bear this image in mind with the chap with the sunglasses on. He looks a bit shady, excuse the pun. So let's just bear in mind for later on. So just general overview, policing the metaverse. Now Mark's already talked about the surveillance that's going to happen. I mean, everything's going to be recorded. Fantastic if you're the platform who has all that information. But from a brand owner perspective, you have absolutely no idea what's going on in the metaverse. All these conversations by fountains, the brand owner doesn't know what's been said. So somehow, brand owners have to be able to monitor in order to pick up the infringements taking place. Ideally, that would be through the platform itself. Maybe the platform will allow accessibility to information. Maybe not. I doubt it. But that's one of the first problems, is just even identifying what egregious acts are actually taking place. Second, even if you've identified these infringing acts, who are the infringers? If you can find the username of this avatar who's hanging out by the fountain in their sunglasses, the username doesn't take you that far. I mean, my experience of usernames is it's a totally make-believe name, often some numbers. You have no chance. So recently we were trying to track down a peddler of an infringing NFT, and we had to do this ridiculously complicated internet trawl of Twitter, Instagram, Facebook for any hint of the same thread of numbers being used by another person, and we actually did identify them in the end. But it takes a lot of time. In the metaverse, it's going to be the same problem. Remedies and enforcements. Even if you've identified the acts, identified the baddies, you then get a court order to stop the infringing acts from taking place. The injunction. How will you enforce that order? In what country do you go to? Even if you then go to the country, it's all quite complicated to enforce. So these are the real challenges. Now, I won't say too much about this because I'm short on time, but 2 points on trademark infringement. The first is there has to be use in the course of trade. The second, and this is our old friend jurisdiction, it has to be in the UK. So just let's seize on those 2 really fundamental points for trademark enforcement. NFTs are cropping up all the time with digital art verified with an NFT, and people are really creative, which is fantastic, but they often use different brands. If you are going to mint your own POAP today, if you've heard about the Bristow's POAP, we're consenting to that use, and if you want to display that on your social media, fantastic. But these are the issues arising. That is that use, if there was no consent, is that use actually as a trademark? So take the scenario, you mint an NFT for personal use, walk around the metaverse, showing everyone this wonderful this NFT. Is that going to be infringing? The people who minted this Toblerone sitting on a rug, is that actually trademark use? Is it just referential use? And I think that's the type of thing that brand owners have to grapple with. There's lots of user-generated content. Is that actually infringing use? Is it use in the course of trade? Next, this is the big one, jurisdiction. It has to be use in the UK. And the central premise is if there is no use in the jurisdiction, there is no trademark infringement. Now, there's 2 cases I'll touch on because everyone loves case law. One is Lifestyle Equities in Amazon. And this was a Court of Appeal decision really recently where the High Court had gone one way and the Court of Appeal overruled it. And they said that if there is a sale to a UK consumer, then that is use in the jurisdiction that is satisfied that criteria. And it's quite fundamental. But often there might not be a trail of a sale. It might just be an offer for sale. And in that case, there's all these listings offering, people can access the website or the e-commerce platform. And this is where L'Oreal and eBay came in. And this was a case looking at offers for sale. Are they infringing? And the Court of Justice recognised that simply because a platform or a website may be accessible, that does not follow that the website or platform is actually making use of the trademark in the UK. And they came up with this concept of targeting. And targeting is actually quite a common concept across intellectual property fields and other fields. And to develop this and to establish whether there is targeting, they set out the criteria. And is it a top-level domain, location, shipping options, currency, location of the parties, phone numbers for customer care, and location of clientele, and languages. So languages. I'm going to get back to subjective intent. So those are the criteria. All fantastic criteria for existing websites and existing platforms. Now, the metaverse, as we've seen, it's this thing, right? Where is it? Where are people located? We just don't know. So just using the example of OpenSea. So I'm sure you're familiar with OpenSea, one of the most popular platforms for buying and selling NFTs. And it's a website. But if we apply those L'Oreal and eBay criteria to just a website, not even the metaverse, we see the problems we're going to be facing. So the first is domain names. The domain name is OpenSea.io. So IO is actually the British Indian Overseas Territory. Doesn't really tell us. It's actually quite common for crypto sites and NFT sites to use. It doesn't tell us anything really about who they're targeting, because there's not really many people in the British Overseas Territory, Indian Overseas Territory. What about language? English? Okay, that's quite common. Location, phone numbers? No, nothing there. Doesn't tell us anything about the seller or the potential shipping. Nothing about shipping, because it's a digital asset. No need to put it in a box and ship it out using DHL. Then, of course, the big one, which is one of the most common triggers we always look at, is the currency. And this is an Ether, cryptocurrency. It's not tied to any fiat national currency. So just using those L'Oreal eBay factors in relation to a website, but a website selling NFTs, we straight away are struggling to reach those objective criteria. So that's why I say maybe it's time to update this area of law and focus more on the subjective intent of the people who are selling the stuff. So there was a recent Court of Appeal case in Merck where the Court of Appeal recognised that subjective intention of the seller could be a relevant factor in circumstances where the objective criteria aren't actually satisfied. In that case, they were well aware that a significant proportion of UK consumers were actually accessing their website. So funny enough, we acted for L'Oreal in the L'Oreal eBay case, so we were advocating those factors, and now maybe it's time we can advocate some other factors to update targeting in the metaverse. So that's definitely a watch the space for the right case. In terms of the Wild West, as you've heard, it's lots of uncertainties, lots of exciting things will happen. Potentially, this could be obviously changes to jurisdiction, which I've talked about briefly on targeting. Maybe this is an area where it's time for some standardized clauses across all the metaverses, where there might be some sort of form of arbitration. By virtue of being a user of that particular metaverse, you have compulsory arbitration. I was at a panel with a WIPO representative recently, and they were going down the line of maybe, with UDRP, that has been a real success in terms of arbitrating disputes regarding domain names. And in the metaverse, maybe there's a role for WIPO in that we can have, rather than going through these really complicated jurisdictional problems, that if you're a user, by default, you have to have some sort of arbitration mechanism. So that is my world in a very, very whistle-stop tour. So thank you very much for listening.